In today's lesson, we're going to learn about the x and y intercepts. You've already learned about the y-intercept. If you recall, the slope-intercept form of a line is y equals mx plus b. The b represents the y-intercept, while the m represents the slope. In our first example, we want to find the x and y-intercept of the line that is provided. Before we begin, let's label these axes. This would be the y-axis, and this would be the x-axis. The point at which the line crosses the y-axis is the y-intercept, and that would be right over here. So let's label this y-intercept. The point at which the line crosses the x-axis would be considered the x-intercept. Besides just identifying the y-intercept and x-intercept, we can also determine their coordinates. So the y-intercept happens to be 0, 2, while the x-intercept happens to be -6, 0. In our second example, we want to find the x and y-intercept of the line provided. Again, the first thing you want to do is label the axes. This is the y-axis, and this is the x-axis. The point at which the line crosses the x-axis would be considered the x-intercept. I'm going to label that over here. And the point at which the line crosses the y-axis would be considered the y-intercept. I'm going to go ahead and figure out the coordinates of the x-intercept. That is -1, 0, while the coordinate of the y-intercept is 0, -3. I've gone ahead and summarized the results from the last two examples. If you take a close look at the x-intercepts for example 1 and example 2, you'll notice a pattern. But before we identify this pattern, let's review some things you already know. Remember, each coordinate is made up of a x and a y coordinate, and x and a y coordinate. For x-intercepts, you'll notice that the y coordinate is always equal to 0, while the x coordinate changes. So I'm just going to make a little note down here. Y is equal to 0, and the x always changes, so I'm going to put a little question mark. We're going to do the exact same thing for the y-intercepts. Remember, each coordinate is made up of a x and y coordinate, an x and a y coordinate. In these y-intercepts, you'll notice that x is always equal to 0, while y changes. So let's summarize that pattern. X is equal to 0, while the y changes all the time, so I'm going to put a little question mark there. With these patterns, we can actually figure out the x and y intercept without using a graph. In our third example, we want to find the x and y intercept of 3x minus 2y minus 6 equals 0, and we want to graph it afterwards. Before we begin, you'll notice something interesting about this equation. This equation is not in slope-intercept form. Remember, I told you slope-intercept form is the most useful form of a line because it tells you information such as the slope and the y-intercept, which means this line is in standard form. Standard form looks something like this. Standard form is very useless because it doesn't tell you anything about the line. Since we haven't been given the graph of this line, there must be another way of figuring out the x and y intercepts. I'm going to show you. In our very first step, let's rewrite this equation. So I'm going to rewrite 3x minus 2y minus 6 equals 0. I'm going to write some instructions below it. Sub y equals 0 to find x-intercept. I'm using the information that you figured out in the previous slide. When you substitute in a number, I like to put that number within brackets. So instead of writing y, you're going to write 0, and then everything stays the same. Let's just highlight that so you know what I'm changing. Let's simplify this a little bit. Anything multiplied by 0 becomes 0. So that is going to become a 0, and everything else stays the same. We don't really like to write zeros in, so let's remove that 0. And that will leave me 3x minus 6 equals 0. I want to isolate x, but x is stuck with a negative 6, and it's stuck with a coefficient of 3. So let's think about negative 6. What is the opposite operation of negative 6? The opposite operation of negative 6 is positive 6, in other words, plus 6. So we are going to add 6 to both sides of this equation. So I'm going to write 3x minus 6 plus 6 equals 0 plus 6. Simplify some of these numbers. Negative 6 plus 6, that's equal to 0. And 0 plus 6 is just 6. So let's clean that up into 3x equals 6. At this point, your x is almost isolated. However, it is stuck with this 3. Remember, when you have a 3 in front of a variable without any sign, that is multiplication. So that is actually multiply by 3. The opposite of multiply by 3 is divide by 3. We're going to divide both sides by 3. Let's simplify some of these numbers. 3 divided by 3 is 1. And 6 divided by 3 is just 2. If you recall, anything multiplied by 1 stays the same. Therefore, I can write this as just x equals 2. At this point, you have enough information to create your x-intercept. So we just figured out that x is equals to 2, and we already know that y is always equal to 0. So let's make a concluding statement here. Therefore, the x-intercept is 2, 0. We're going to do the exact same steps to figure out the y-intercept of this line, and I'm going to do that over here on the side. First thing you want to do is write down the equation of the line. So we have 3x minus 2y minus 6 is equal to 0. Using the information from the previous slide, we can say this. Sub x equals 2 to find the y-intercept. I'm going to switch out my x for this 0, and when I do that, I want to use brackets. So 3 bracket 0 bracket minus 2y minus 6 equals 0. Let's clean up some of these numbers. Anything multiplied by 0 is 0, and everything else stays the same. I don't like writing zeros in, so I'm going to remove that. So that just becomes negative 2y minus 6 equals 0. Remember, you want to isolate y. You want it all by itself. However, it's stuck with this negative 6, and it's stuck with a coefficient of negative 2. Let's get rid of this negative 6 first. If you recall, the opposite of negative 6 is plus 6. So we're going to plus 6 to both sides of this equation. So I'm going to have negative 2y subtract 6 plus 6 equals 0 plus 6. Let's clean up some of these numbers. Negative 6 plus 6 is 0, and 0 plus 6 is 6. So I'm going to have negative 2y equals 6. We're almost done. The y is still stuck with this negative 2y. If you recall, when you have a number in front of a variable, the operation is multiplication. So what we have here is multiply by negative 2. The opposite of multiply by negative 2 is divide by negative 2. So I'm going to divide both sides by negative 2. Negative 2 divided by negative 2 is positive 1. And 6 divided by negative 2 is negative 3. Anything multiplied by 1 stays the same, so I'm going to remove the 1, and y equals negative 3 is my final answer. But let's go ahead and summarize all this information into a concluding sentence. So we already knew that x is always equal to 0 when you're talking about a y-intercept, and we've just figured out the y-intercept over here. So I'm going to say, therefore, the y-intercept is 0, negative 3. At this point, I'm going to take both intercepts and I'm going to graph them on this blank graph I have over here. So the first coordinate that I'm going to graph is 2, 0. 2, 0 would be right over here. That would be considered the x-intercept. I'm going to graph 0, negative 3, which is right over here. That would be considered the y-intercept. Once you have those 2 points, you can connect them with a straight line. And that's all you need to do. In our fourth example, we're going to do the exact same thing as our previous example, except we're going to do it to 5x plus 2y minus 10 equals 0. I'm going to go a little bit faster in this example, but the steps are the same thing as the previous example. Let's do the work over on the side. Start with the equation of your line. 5x plus 2y minus 10 equals 0. We're going to say sub y equals 0 to find the x-intercept. What I'm going to do is I'm going to substitute in that value. So everything else stays the same. I'm going to put that value in brackets. We're going to clean up this. Anything multiplied by 0 is 0. However, I don't really like to write zeros in, so we're going to take that out, and everything else stays the same. Remember, we want to isolate the variable of x. However, it's stuck with subtract 10, and it's stuck with a coefficient of 5. I'm going to deal with this first. Remember, the opposite of subtract 10 or negative 10 is plus 10 or positive 10. I'm going to do that to both sides of the equation. So I have 5x minus 10 plus 10 equals 0 plus 10. Let's go ahead and clean up some of these numbers. Remember, negative 10 plus 10 is 0. I'm not going to write that in. And 0 plus 10 is 10. Again, this variable of x is stuck with a 5. This is multiply by 5. The opposite of multiply by 5 is divide by 5. We're going to divide both sides by 5. 5 divided by 5 is 1, and 10 divided by 5 is 2. Anything multiplied by 1 stays the same, so I can remove the 1, that just becomes x, and x is equal to 2. I'm going to write a concluding sentence with the information I've just figured out. So, y is equal to 0, x is equal to 2. I'm going to write, therefore, the x-intercept is 2, 0. I'm going to do the exact same steps to figure out the y-intercept over on the side. Let's begin by rewriting the equation of the line, which is 5x plus 2y minus 10 equals to 0. I'm going to write a little note for myself. Sub x equals 0 to find the y-intercept. When I substitute that value in, I'm going to use brackets, and everything else stays the same. Anything multiplied by 0 is 0. So let's simplify that. I don't like to write zeros in, so let's take that out in the next step. We want to isolate y, but y is stuck with a coefficient of 2 and is stuck with a negative 10. Let's get rid of this negative 10. The opposite of negative 10 is plus 10. I'm going to plus 10 to both sides of the equation. 2y minus 10 plus 10 equals 0 plus 10. Let's simplify some of these numbers. Negative 10 plus 10, that becomes 0. The 2y stays the same. 0 plus 10 is 10. We're almost finished, but our variable of y is still stuck with this coefficient of 2. Remember, that is multiply by 2. To get rid of it, you want to do the opposite. You want to divide by 2. Therefore, we're going to divide both sides by 2. 2 divided by 2 is 1. 10 divided by 2 is 5. Remember, anything multiplied by 1 stays exactly the same, so y is equal to 5. Let's summarize all the information that we've just determined. We know that y is equal to 5 and x is equal to 0. Therefore, the y-intercept is 0, 5. We can now use both these pieces of information to graph our line. Let's go ahead and zoom in on our blank graph paper. I'm going to graph the coordinate 2, 0 first, and that is located right over here. That would be considered the x-intercept. Next, I'm going to graph the y-intercept. The y-intercept is 0, 5. That would be right over there. Once you have those 2 points, all you do is connect the dots, and that is your line.